childish pursuit of the wind. Yet, foolish as it was, he liked to watch them. There was a thrill in the sweeping start of 20 or 30 horsemen that warmed a man, making him feel as if he must whoop and wave his hat. There was a belief alive among them that some day a man would come who would run the train neck and neck to the depot platform. Not much distinction in it, even so, said he, but it set him musing and considering as he rode, his face quickening out of its somber cloud. A little while after his arrival at Misery, the news went around that the Duke was willing at last to enter the race against the Flyer. True to his peculiarities, the Duke had made conditions. He was willing to race, but only if everybody else would keep out of it and give him a clear and open field. Tatterleg Wilson, the bow-legged camp cook of the syndicate, circulated himself like a petition to gain consent to his unusual proposal. It was asking a great deal of these men to give up their established diversion, no matter how distinguished the man in whose favor they were requested to stand aside. That Sunday afternoon race had become as much a fixed institution in the Bad Lands as the railroad itself. With some arguments, some bucking and snorting, a considerable cost to Tatterleg for liquor and cigars, they agreed to it. Tatterleg said he could state authoritatively that this would be the Duke's first, last, and only ride against the Flyer. It would be worth money to stand off and watch it, he said, and worth putting money on the result. When, where would a man ever have a chance to see such a race again? Perhaps never in his life. On time to the dot, the station agent told a committee headed by Tatterleg, which had gone to inquire in the grave and important manner of men conducting a ceremony. The committee went back to the saloon and pressed the Duke to have a drink. He refused, as he had refused politely and consistently all day. A man could fight on booze, he said, but it was a mighty poor foundation for business. There was a larger crowd in Misery that day than usual for the time of year, it being the first general holiday after the winter's hard exactions. In addition to visitors, all Misery turned out to see the race, lining up at the right-of-way fence as far as they would go, which was not a great distance along. The saloon-keeper could see the finish from his door. On the start of it he was not concerned, but he had money upon the end. Lambert hadn't as much flesh by a good many pounds as he had carried into the Bad Lands on his bicycle. One who had known him previously would have thought that 7 years had passed him, making him over completely. Indeed, since then his face was thin, browned, and weathered, his body sinewy, its leanness aggravated by its length. He was as light in the saddle as a leaf on the wind. He was quite a barbaric figure as he waited to mount and ride against the train, which could be heard whistling far down the road. Coatless and flannel shirt, a bright silk handkerchief round his neck, calfskin vest, tanned with the hair on, its color red and white, dressed leather chaps, a pair of boots that had cost him 2/3 of a month's pay. His hat was like 40 others in the crowd, dough-colored, worn with high crown, full standing, a leather thong at the back of his head, the brim drooping a bit from the weather, so broad that his face looked narrower and sharper in its shadow. Nothing like the full-blooded young Aggie who had come into the Bad Lands to find his fortune a little less than a year before, and about as different from him in thought and outlook upon life as in physical appearance. The psychology of environment is a powerful force. A score or more of horsemen were strung out along the course, where they had stationed themselves to watch the race at its successive stages and cheer their champion on his way. At the starting point the Duke waited alone. At the station a crowd of cowboys lolled in their saddles, not caring to make a run to see the finish. It was customary for the horsemen who raced the Flyer to wait on the ground until the engine rounded the curve, then mount and settle to the race. It was counted fair, also, owing to the headway the train already had, to start 100 yards or so before the engine came abreast, in order to limber up to the horse's best speed. For 2 miles or more the track ran straight after that curve, Misery about the middle of the stretch. In that long, straight reach the builders of the road had begun the easement of the stiff grade through the hills beyond. It was the beginning of a hard climb, a stretch in which westbound trains gathered headway to carry them over the top. engines came panting round that curve, laboring with the strain of their load. Speed reduced half, and dropping a bit lower as they proceeded up the grade. This Sunday, as usual, the train crew and passengers were on the lookout for the game sportsman of misery. Already the engineer was leaning out of his window, arm extended, ready to give the derisive challenge to come on as he swept by. The Duke was in the saddle, holding in Whetstone with stiff rein, for the animal was trembling with eagerness to spring away, knowing very well from the preparations which had been going forward that some big event in the lives of his master and himself was pending. The Duke held him, looking back over his shoulder, measuring the distance as the train came sweeping grandly round the curve. He waited until the engine was within 100 feet of him, before he loosened rein and let old Whetstone go. A yell ran up the line of spectators as the pale yellow horse reached out his long neck, chin level against the wind like a swimmer, and ran as no horse ever had run on that racecourse before. Every horseman knew that the Duke was still holding him in, allowing the train to creep up on him, as if he scorned to take advantage of the handicap. The engineer saw this was going to be a different kind of race from the yelling, chattering troop of wild riders, which he had been outrunning with unbroken regularity. In that yellow streak of a horse, that low, bending, bony rider, he saw a possibility of defeat and disgrace. His head disappeared out of the window. His derisive hand vanished. He was turning valves and pulling levers, trying to coax a little more power into his piston strokes. The Duke held Whetstone back until his wind had set to the labor. His muscles flexed, his sinews stretched to the race. A third of the race was covered, when the engine came neck and neck with the horse, and the engineer, confident now, leaned far out, swinging his hand over like an oar of a boat, and shouted, "Come on! Come on!" Just a moment too soon, this confidence. A moment too soon, this defiance. It was the Duke's program to run this thing neck and neck, force to force, with no advantage asked or taken. Then if he could gather speed and beat the engine on the home stretch, no man, on the train or off, could say that he had done it with the advantage of a handicap. There was a great whooping, a great thumping of hoofs, a monstrous swirl of dust, as the riders at the side of the racecourse saw the Duke maneuver and read his intention. Away they swept, a noisy troop, like a flight of blackbirds, hats off, guns popping, in the scramble to get up as close to the finish line as possible. Never before in the long history of that unique contest had there been so much excitement. Porters opened the vestibule doors, allowing passengers to crowd the steps. Windows were open, heads thrust out, every tongue urging the horsemen on with cheers. The Duke was riding beside the engineer, not 10 feet between them. More than half the course was run, and there the Duke hung, the engineer not gaining an inch. The engineer was on his feet now, hand on the throttle lever, although it was open as wide as it could be pulled. The fireman was throwing coal into the furnace, looking round over his shoulder, and now and then the persistent horseman, who would not be outrun, his eyes white in his grimy face. On the observation car, women hung over the rail at the side, waving handkerchiefs at the rider. Back along the fence, the inhabitants of misery broke away like leaves before a wind and went running toward the depot. Ahead of the racing horse and engine, the mounted men who had taken a big start rode on towards the station in a wild, delirious charge. Neck and neck with the engine, old Whetstone ran, throwing his long legs like a wolfhound, his long neck stretched, his ears flat, not leaving a hair that he could control, outstanding to catch the wind. The engineer was peering ahead with fixed eyes now, as if he feared to look again at this puny combination of horse and man that was holding its own in this unequal trial of strength. Within 300 yards of the station platform, which sloped down at the end like a continuation of the course, the Duke touched Whetstone's neck with the tips of his fingers, as if he had given a signal upon which they had agreed. The horse gathered power, grunting as he used a grunt in the days of his old outlawry, and bounded away from the cab window, where the greasy engineer stood with white face and set jaw. Yard by yard the horse gained, his long mane flying, his long tail astream, foam on his lips, forging past the great driving wheels, which ground against the rails, past the swinging piston, past the powerful black cylinders, past the stubby pilot, advancing like a shadow over the track. When Whetstone's hoof struck the planks of the platform, marking the end of the course, he was more than the length of the engine in the lead. The Duke sat there, waving his hand solemnly to those who cheered him as the train swept past.